In this video, I will examine the religious legislation of the Soviet Union and the practice of its implementation. Following the 1917 revolution in the Russian Empire, the Bolsheviks assumed power and declared the separation of church and state. This separation was particularly targeted at the Russian Orthodox Church, which had essentially functioned as a state institution. Consequently, the initial phase of religious persecution in the Soviet Union aimed at the Orthodox Church as a potential source of counter-revolution. Additionally, given that materialism was an inherent component of communist ideology, religion was perceived as a hindrance to the realization of a radiant communist future. Atheism was now the state religion. In the early years of Soviet rule, Protestant denominations were not persecuted. Moreover, compared to the Russian Empire, they began a period of freedom. During the autocracy, the Orthodox Church initiated persecution of Protestants in every possible way, but with the advent of Soviet power came freedom. They were allowed to gather freely, open houses of worship, educational institutions, and publish their own newspapers and magazines. Ivan Prokhanov, the leader of the Molokan movement in Russia, opened Christian agricultural communes and even received permission from government agencies to build a Christian city in Siberia, which was to be called Evangelsk. However, when information about this reached Stalin, he caused a scandal at a Politburo meeting and the project was closed. While Lenin is generally considered the primary antagonist against religion in the USSR, Prokhanov, in his memoirs, suggests that if Lenin had lived longer, the severe repressions against Christians witnessed under Stalin might not have occurred. Although, it is quite possible that it was the scandal of his attempt to build a religious city in the Soviet Union that motivated Stalin to launch more systematic repressions against Christians, now directed at Protestants. This repression intensified in 1928. And in 1929, new religious legislation was adopted. The main norms of this decree were in effect throughout the entire period of the Soviet Union, so let's look at them. This is how the government intended to limit the activities of the Church. Subparagraph A prohibits religious organizations from any activity that could be aimed at their financial self-sufficiency. The Church must be poor, so its influence will be limited. Subparagraph B prohibits the Church from providing material support to its members. Only the Soviet government could be a benefactor. The next paragraph prohibits holding any gatherings that might have a social role. It is forbidden to hold children's, youth, or women's meetings, and it is forbidden to teach needlework or any labor skills in the Church. It is forbidden to hold classes on the systematic study of one's faith. Even children's playgrounds are prohibited. Children in church should be as bored as possible. The prohibition of libraries is spelled out twice. For Protestants, this meant that only the Bible and books with song lyrics could be kept in houses of worship. Christian fiction, apologetic, or theological literature was prohibited. And if you want to read something, there is the Lenin Library. Obviously, all of these measures were aimed at marginalizing the role of the Church in the lives of community members as much as possible. One can only come there to listen to a sermon, pray, and sing a few songs. All other aspects of human existence should not be associated with the Church, and it is even more impossible to hold events that might be of interest to non-church people. Paragraph 19 was aimed at restricting churches in missionary activities, as well as limiting contacts with other communities. Ministers could carry out their activities only within their church. Congregations were to become closed centers that did not receive any fresh impetus from other churches. Intra-church life was to be as monotonous as possible. Paragraph 25 stipulated that all property of religious organizations became the property of the state. It was a convenient tool for closing religious institutions. After all, everything is now state-owned, and you can hold your meetings or services only with the goodwill of the government. The confiscation of houses of worship and churches began directly in the 29th year. By the 30th year, 60% of the premises had been confiscated, and by the 38th year, the number had increased to 95%. In the 32nd year, the idea of the so-called godless 5-year plan was announced. The goal was to completely eliminate religion by the 37th year. By 1938 almost all houses of worship and churches were closed, and tens of thousands of Christians of various denominations were repressed. Some were shot and others were sent to camps. Church history professor Walter Zawatsky wrote that only Hitler's attack on the Soviet Union saved the Church from complete destruction. Since the Soviet Union could not win the war against the Axis powers, Germany and the Allies, on its own, Stalin was forced to seek help from Britain and the United States. These countries demanded that the Soviet regime respect the rights of believers. In addition, in the German-occupied territories, the occupation administration opened churches and did not oppose religious activity. For example, 5,400 churches and 36 monasteries were opened on the territory of Ukraine during the occupation. This was used for propaganda against the Soviet government, which closed all these churches, fighting against religion. Given all these factors, Stalin was forced to stop the terror against believers. The activities of religious organizations were resumed, but placed under the close supervision of the special services. But the legislation remained the same. Therefore, in 1958, the next Secretary General of the Soviet Union, Khrushchev, began a new anti-religious campaign. It is said that he promised to show The Last Believer on television by 1980. A whole series of anti-religious films are being made. One of them tries to convince people throughout the Soviet Union that Pentecostals sacrifice people. From that moment on, many Soviet people lived with this belief. Significant funds are poured into anti-religious propaganda, institutions are created to fight against religion, and a large number of anti-religious materials are printed. In the 50s, the authorities realized that they could not re-educate adult believers, and they directed their efforts to counteract the religious education of children. The goal was to limit minors' access to church as much as possible. Since the 60s, the number of unregistered, or illegal, churches has been growing significantly. They set up underground printing houses, print Bibles and other literature, conduct officially forbidden classes with children, and so on. They also transmit evidence of religious oppression in the USSR to the West. Some of the leaders of this movement cooperate with Soviet dissidents and human rights activists. The official publication of the Bible was possible only with the permission of the authorities. Permission was rarely granted, and the print runs were small. There were not enough Bibles, so the shortage was partially covered by illegal printing houses and smuggling. Let's get back to the legislation. In 1966, the authorities amended the law on cults. Apparently, the official churches found a way to circumvent the previously imposed bans by inventing new names for church events. Therefore, the following changes were made to the text. Now it is clarified that it is forbidden to hold recreation evenings. A Soviet citizen has the right to relax only in a club or a beer bar, but not in a church. A ban on the organization of amateur artistic activity was also prescribed. Plays, musical performances, poetry recitations, and the like are now outlawed. A Soviet person could engage in amateur artistic activity only in the Palace of Pioneers. Here is a typical document of this era, a decree banning caroling in Lithuania. An important aspect of the religious persecution of the Khrushchev era was that it was directed primarily against Protestant denominations. Protestants were more suspicious than Orthodox Christians. After Khrushchev's ouster from power, persecution eased for a while, but then resumed. Due to the unbearable conditions for believers, in the 70s, the emigration movement was active in USSR. They demanded the following from the authorities: since you do not allow us to live according to our beliefs in the Soviet Union, give us the opportunity to leave. Many leaders of this movement are arrested. The campaign against minors attending churches persists, marked by the implementation of a practice where school teachers monitor students near churches and document their attendance, in order to conduct educational work later. But even in the 80s, the class teacher tried to intimidate my class before Christmas, saying that teachers would be standing near the churches, and if any of the students went to church, they would get into trouble. Moscow was particularly concerned about the religious situation in Ukraine. In his diary, party functionary Anatoly Cherniev describes one of the meetings of the Communist Party Secretariat. The speakers were shocked by the huge number of religious organizations in Ukraine. They see this as a threat to the Soviet way of life. The Soviet way of life at that time was characterized by widespread drunkenness, which a year later would lead to a large-scale but unsuccessful anti-alcohol campaign. Let me summarize. The main objective of the legislation on cults in the USSR was to make the church a place of religious rituals only and to limit in every possible way activities aimed at the comprehensive development of its members or specialized work with different social and age groups. The source of anti-religious initiatives and persecution was Russia. The laws were first introduced there and then adopted by other republics of the USSR.